Well, good afternoon to all of you. It is a pleasure to be here. And I have my nonprofit hat on tonight. The FreedomWorks Foundation is our 501c3 arm. FreedomWorks also has a 501c4, which it's most famous for, and then 2 PACs. But today I'm going to tell you about what we do at FreedomWorks Foundation, where I direct the Regulatory Action Center. And we do, in fact, attempt to rein in the regulators. We call it the RAC. Everything's got to have an acronym, right? And we do education, as you might expect at a 501c3. And it's what I would call a pretty boring subject. But there are lots of activists willing to drink in this otherwise fairly boring topic of how you fight regulations in this bureaucratic process. And we have had great success educating many new activists and our activists in how they can do this to expand economic opportunity and liberty. I wrote a book a few years back when I was Attorney General called The Last Line of Defense, which is what I assert state attorneys general are against the federal government. You can guess who was president at the time. And it was federalism in action. And in that experience, I learned very firsthand just what an enormous burden the regulatory state poses, not just economically, and economically is not why I'm raising this point with you, but on freedom, And we're familiar with the economic pie. It grows and shrinks with different government policies. I came up with the liberty pie, which does not change size, and it has 2 slices: government power and citizens' freedom. And unlike the economy, that is a zero-sum game. Every single regulation that government imposes, whether it's state, local, federal, dictates to us how to live our lives, run our businesses, and therefore takes those decisions away from us. That reduces your freedom. So at this conference, like most conferences, you're going to hear about the dollar impacts. And in fact, I'm going to touch on the REINS Act here, where we're going to talk about the $100 million threshold. And that's important. It is an objective way to measure how we're doing economically, how much burden the government is putting on us. And look, before I went to the dark side and went to law school, I was an engineer. So I'm a numbers person. I appreciate that perspective. But what makes America unique is not our economic potential. It is our liberty potential. It was founders who put as the highest order of government individual liberty. That's what makes us unique. And everything that flows from that concept makes America unique historically. And it is a focus for us at FreedomWorks. Freedom Works is not a coincidental name. It is a descriptive name. And regulation is an excellent example of why people like us should be focused on the freedom lost in regulation. One of the things we point out in the RAC is how you can lower, well, what we do is lower the barriers to citizen participation in the regulatory process. For those of you that work in nonprofits for 501c3s, one of the reasons we set this whole project up is because there are no limits from the IRS on what we can do in the regulatory arena. Now, as a 501c3, we can't go lobby for or against legislation, but there are no such restrictions on regulations. And I'm not sure a lot of people in 501c3s right of center know that. But I want you to know that, and we're taking full advantage of that. Well, that was the backwards. We'll let government do that. There are lots of ways to look at the regulatory process, but I'll look at it in terms of the conservative movement. And there are 3 parts. First are the think tanks. Heartland's brought a lot of those together here. Heartland contributes to that. The think tanks that analyze government action and proposed government action almost to the point that you'd find in academia. And in fact, sometimes some of our think tanks can be very academic-like, including their bureaucracy. But that analysis is very valuable. It's very deep. It's done by experts. When you think across the spectrum of the conservative movement, we have lots of great brains, some of them are right here. And that's a resource for us. FreedomWorks has gotten out of that business. Instead, we partner up with the AEIs and the Catos and the Heritages, and the list goes on and on and on for us among conservatives. And we weaponize that analysis to be used by ordinary Americans who really would rather see that white paper in about 500 words, or 250 on a good day. There's twofold value to that. We make this ammo accessible to ordinary Americans. And we tell our members, you're entitled to participate in this process. This is how you do it. And in fact, under the Administrative Procedures Act, if agencies don't do this effectively, courts will sometimes throw out their work. And believe it or not, under the Obama administration, we could produce on occasion sufficient waves against proposed regulation that even they pulled the regulations. So just in the last year, bless you, we've done about 2 trainings a month across the country, roughly. We've trained over 1,000 activists, and we cover both the legal and the constitutional issues, the liberty perspective, and we talk to them in a how-to format. How do you get engaged in this process? How do you have an impact? Here's some happy pictures from one of those trainings in South Carolina. It's pretty good attendance for a regulatory workshop, wouldn't you say? But these are freedom-loving Americans who realize that liberty is at stake in this process. One of the things that in the second, I told you about the 3 parts to the pipeline on fighting regulations. We talked about think tanks. Second is us, is those of us who engage in the comment process. It is the grassroots part of the regulatory process. FreedomWorks Foundation is nearly the only, and certainly the only, large right-of-center limited government organization that regularly engages in this arena with the left across issues. Now, today we're talking about energy, and we've had good participation on energy issues with our activists, but the one that's lit them up the most in the last 2 years is net neutrality, because of the rather obvious freedom implications, in my view. And anybody who's operating in this arena where we're communicating so much via social media, naturally anything before the FCC is going to be a high priority, but EPA is not far behind in the interest it generates from our activists, and yours too. Yours too. I'm telling you, if you let your people know how they can engage, they will, because it does have a real impact. And the Trump administration now, going the other way from the Obama administration, needs support to undo regulatory burdens. They can't do it if they have to go into court and defend these things, which they will have to do, and they have no demonstration of public support. They need our support. And that's what FreedomWorks Foundation does in that second part of the anti-regulatory pipeline. The third part is what I used to do as Attorney General, and that's litigate. And overwhelmingly, this is Republican attorneys general, like Attorney General Landry, who is here this morning, and others, We don't presume it'll exclusively be them, but historically, with a few exceptions in coal states, and even those were rare exceptions, it's been overwhelmingly Republican. But there are other partners as well. Out in affected industries will sue, and we partner up with those folks. We bring them into the public comment period. I can tell you, as Attorney General of the 12th most populous state, I had 3 people on my staff of 450 who could dedicate their time to this relatively full time. 2 of them were lawyers and 1 was their legal secretary. That was it. That was it. And so it is hard to bring a lot of force to bear for those partners in that third part of the pipeline, the litigators. They can litigate, but they don't have the manpower to watch what's coming down the pipeline and to address it. The left started doing this in the 70s. The environmental groups, the Sierra Club probably has a budget that equals all the organizations in this room on an annual basis. So they do all 3 parts of this. They do their own think tanking, or what they call think tanking. Propaganda has to start somewhere. And they have their own activist chain, and that's where what you see here is so important, is they generate mass comments. And the courts and the agencies have come to the conclusion and let it be known that they treat duplicate comments as one comment. So what we have done is we have moved as hard as we can to train people to give unique comments. And that takes me back to that 500 or 250 word weaponization of think tank materials. We feed it up to our activists after training them to try to individualize their comments, especially people for whom it actually affects their real life. In the last year, and actually this is an out-of-date number now, we're probably over 80,000 comments submitted in the last 12 months. That may sound like a lot to you, it may sound like a little, but in comparison to what was going on in any particular regulatory item that we were attacking, it turned out to be a lot of comments. Here are some of the items that we did in the energy space, and some of these you all will recognize, some not so much. Clean Power Plan repeal, you can see, had an enormous response. Waters of the United States, a very large response, and so forth. We also attended many of the field hearings on the offshore program that the Department of Interior announced like that. I mean, the first hearings were days after they first announced it, and we were driving people to them in state capitals. I mentioned the REINS Act earlier, being with my 501c3 hat on. I won't take a position on it, but it is important to note there is a legislative element to this discussion, and that is the attempt in recent years to get the REINS Act in one form or another, and that would require any new regulation of over $100 million economic impact to be voted on by Congress. This has got important separation of powers implications. It makes people who are accountable to us, elected officials, actually have to take a position on individual regulations. And setting aside what you may think about any particular regulation or another, from a constitutional perspective, which is where I always start, old habits, this is a novel, frankly, concept in the last 50 years to rein in this administrative state and to cycle it through Congress, an accountable elected bodies, House and Senate. Needless to say, those who want government to have massive power would prefer not to have that government accountable. Accountability is a problem if you actually have to convince people that you were right, as we've seen. That they only seem to make headway when they have the equivalent of a propaganda effort that can work. The discussions of global warming that have gone on here today would be a case in point, maybe one of the greatest cases in point ever. Nonetheless, this is something worthy of consideration. There are ways around it. You can play with the numbers and break one regulation of $200 million into three of $67 million each and impact, but you still have to do it. And it does still provide a form of accountability. And if you're breaking them up that way, you're trying to avoid accountability, which in itself is a signal to the American people. So that's what we're doing at FreedomWorks Foundation. Let's see. There we go. Back to title page. And I'll turn the mic over. Look forward to your questions. I'm glad you all are in here. And I would urge you to weigh into this. This is a battle that you can help the Trump administration in, and your members can help the Trump administration in, to reduce the burden on our economy and on our freedom in the regulatory process. Thank you all very much.